Greetings, everybody. Welcome to another edition of the midweek update here from Rasslin with Redbeard. I'm your host, Redbeard, and this is the show where we get together and talk about the goings-on of the world of professional wrestling. It gives me a little bit of an opportunity to keep a conversation flowing with everybody in between editions of the main show here from Rasslin with Redbeard. Wanted to begin the program here this week by picking up a story that's a little bit old. It's from a couple of weeks ago when Pro Wrestling Guerrilla was running their Mystery Vortex 3 event. They had a pretty unique surroundings there for that particular show because they are, of course, a California-based promotion, but they wound up having two of the, I'd say, top celebrities in the world right now in their audience that night. They had Sofia Vergara and I'm not going to attempt to pronounce the man's last name. I'll just say that it's her boyfriend, Joe. Yeah, we'll leave it at that. He's in Magic Mike. I know he's in that movie there, but at any rate, they were at the show, and it kind of blew my mind the fact that you had two people like that just show up at a little independent event along those lines. This PWG, despite the fact that it is a very well-known independent, it's still just a regular independent promotion, just like what we have around here in the Carolinas. They just so happen to be blessed by the fact that they exist in the part of the world where there are celebrities who can just randomly pop in for a date night like the two of them did. So that was a pretty cool thing. I just thought I'd bring that up because that's something that you don't see very often. They got a lot of attention because of the fact that Sophia was tweeting and making some various posts on Instagram and social media about the fact that they were there. It made for a pretty entertaining little spectacle there. Also, in regard to that show, they had some pretty interesting goings on in that Trevor Lee and Andrew Everett, who are two guys who are from this part of the world, they were the PWG Tag Team Champions going into the show. They are not anymore. They wound up losing the titles to the Young Bucks. At the end of the show, you had the Young Bucks and Roderick Strong, Super Dragon, who returned, wind up forming a new version of the Mount Rushmore stable. They're calling it Mount Rushmore 2.0. This was, of course, something they had going in advance. They knew they were going to do it, and they were so far in their planning stages of doing it that they had t-shirts ready to go by the point in time that the end of the show came around. So, pretty funny little thing that only someone like PWG or something like PWG would be able to get away with in doing it that way. Moving on to more national and global type of news, we've got some interesting stuff happening with TNA. They've gone so far as to hire what they're calling a chief strategy officer. It's a gentleman by the name of Eric Sherman. This news came out late last week, and it was a little bit baffling to me because you've got them resorting to making announcements over the fact that they're hiring executive officers who are undoubtedly getting paid significant amounts of money, but they're not making any type of strides to sign new talent, does it seem like. That is another sign, in my opinion, of things going where they are with TNA. This guy, again, I don't know what that job description entails. It sounds like something that's going to be involved in marketing, potentially the creation of new intellectual properties, managing those. I'm not really sure. But regardless, they've got this guy who has, apparently from what I could find on his credentials, zero knowledge of the professional wrestling business. He worked primarily with MTV networks in terms of dealing with their TV broadcasts and whatnot. But here again, nothing to do with wrestling. And it's not going to help, I don't think. You're hiring people who are doing these types of jobs, but if you bring in top talent, you won't have to worry about creating things for them. They'll create a buzz themselves by being there and by doing what they can do. So here again, you've got an example of TNA who's trying to right a ship that's already pretty well capsized, in my opinion anyway. In addition to that, you've got some interesting things happening in regard to TNA and Global Force Wrestling, who are apparently in some type of an alliance now. I'm not sure what the business deal is that they've got going, but it apparently is going to involve some type of a talent swap because you're seeing guys who were with TNA, possibly still are with TNA, showing up on Global Force Wrestling cards. Guys like James Storm, Bobby Roode, Eric Young, and others who are, of course, mainstays in TNA are now showing up on Global Force programs. That's all well and good. It's just a little bit odd because in some of these cases you've got guys like, for example, AJ Styles, who has had a very well documented tumultuous relationship with Dixie Carter, president of TNA, and now you've got some lines interceding and crossing and whatnot, and it's just very peculiar in that bedfellows become as strange as they do in professional wrestling. That's like the old saying goes, never say never. But in the case of TNA and Global Force, it's seemingly coming about because um, they're stirring the pot and they're mixing things up. I don't know that it's going to do a whole lot for either brand, unfortunately, because looking at some of the Global Force Wrestling cards that they've got coming up, for example, this weekend here, you've got this continuation of the ballpark booking that they've got where they're making shows at baseball stadiums. The cards that they're featuring, just they don't really do anything, even for someone like me who's a fan of wrestling and who's a fan of independent wrestling. It's just one of those things to where the combination of talent does not drive up my flagpole, if you know what I'm saying. But I don't know. We'll see where it goes. Hopefully it'll pan out for them and they can get into something of a bit more regular, more stabilized roster on both sides, and continue to move onward and upward, as it's a bit of a confusing landscape right now, in my opinion. But in regard to more happier news, in regard to some folks who are on the other side of the aisle, if you want to call it that, Kevin Owens, who's a WWE superstar, he was recently named by Rolling Stone magazine as their Wrestler of the Year so far for the year 2015. Notice I said Wrestler of the Year so far. That's because they're naming him as sort of a talent to watch at this point of the calendar year. That's a great achievement for him. It shows the fact that he's made a big impact on the sport in general, despite the fact that he's only been on the main roster for a couple of months. That's a pretty big achievement. You know, you've got people who are paying attention to him, paying attention to the brands because of the things that he's doing and because of what he's capable of bringing to the product. I thought it was interesting for two other points there, the fact that they referred to him as Wrestler of the Year and not Superstar of the Year. I'm sure if this had been a WWE publication, it would have been Superstar of the Year, but the fact that they referenced him as a professional wrestler means that they, meaning WWE, have not succeeded yet in changing the vernacular completely of what people perceive professional wrestling as being. They're not going to call people superstars. They're going to call them professional wrestlers because that's what they still are, believe it or not. Other part of that I would definitely want to point out is the fact that I almost said Steen. Kevin Owens, of course, was Kevin Steen at one point in his life, but Owens has had a great couple of feuds here to build his presence in WWE, especially on the main roster, working with John Cena. He and Cena had a beautiful couple of matches there, and the United States title was on the line for a number of those matches, or at least involved in some of those scenarios. The fact that the two of them worked together as well as they did shows a lot about Cena's ability, I think, and I've praised him a couple times on this particular show. I'm going to praise him again for the fact that he had a great match with Antonio Cesaro this past Monday on the July, what was this, the 6th edition of Monday Night Raw. Great match. You can't say enough for the things that Cena's doing right now in terms of being an in-ring competitor. And he's working with top talent as well. He's really elevating a lot of these guys, Cesaro being one of them, who really could use a shot in the arm, and he's getting it right now, because not only did he come out of that looking strong in terms of having a great match with Cena, but he also was able to get a bit of a feud going with Kevin Owens there. So hopefully good things are happening for him. He's been one of those guys who's been criticized in the past for not being able to connect with fans by certain people, but I think he's doing it by his performance. Maybe not so much by his character, but definitely getting over with what his abilities can convey in the ring there. Moving on from there into more WWE news, there's been some, I'll go ahead and say, ongoing litigation involving a number of former WWE superstars and talent in regard to injuries that they've sustained during their careers. You've had a lot of guys who've come forward and they've wanted to press charges against WWE. Well, not press charges, but they've wanted to seek monetary gains by way of saying, you asked us to do certain things that led to various types of head injuries and whatnot. This kind of seems like an offshoot, in my opinion, of what former players from the NFL were able to do in filing suits against the NFL, saying, you knew that we were out there risking our lives for the sake of other people's entertainment, and yet you allowed us to continue doing it regardless and didn't encourage us to engage in safer practices, this, that, and the other. I'm going to take a stance with this because the fact that now you've had here in the past 7 days the mother of Doink the Clown, Matt Bourne, the original Doink the Clown, I should say, come forward and engage in one of these lawsuits as well. Professional wrestling is not like the NFL or football or any other sport. Professional wrestling is a sport or a form of entertainment where when you get into it, you know that you're likely going to be dropped on your head at some point in time. This is not ballet, this is not football, this is not anything else. This is a form of entertainment where people are taking falls and you know what's going to happen, or what potentially could happen, I should say, when you get in the ring. Granted, people didn't always know that concussions could be as bad as they are, but they knew that injuries could happen. That said, the allure of fame, fortune, being on TV and all that is enough to keep people coming back, in my opinion. And unfortunately, I think this is a situation that's going to go on for a while, because you've got one side who's filing lawsuits against another, and it's going back and forth now because WWE has tried to engage in some countersuits to potentially block this type of litigation from happening in the future. On the one hand, I can kind of agree with them protecting themselves, but on the other, you kind of hope that they would say, hey guys, we know that this is happening, we know that you guys have had some issues, we'd like to help you, but we can't, just hand out money hand over fist. That's the type of thing that could, put them in a lot of hot water financially, in terms of the number of guys who could potentially come up and say, hey, I'm hurt now, you've got to help me out. So we'll see where that goes, but it's been a very tumultuous time in terms of the legalese that's been sprouted out, because you've got some guys who are saying, well, this injury happened in such and such part of my career, but then you've got them not acknowledging the fact that they were only with WWE for 2 or 3 years, maybe 5, and yet they continued to wrestle on for 5, 10, 15 years after the fact. What about those injuries? Are you considering the fact that you were liable for those yourself, or what exactly there? So again, it's something that will get settled in court, and I'm sure it'll be a nice, long, ugly process. So we'll continue to follow that. Continuing WWE matters, we had an interesting program this past Saturday on July 4th, oddly enough. WWE coming to us live from Japan for the Beast in the East special. This was a really great show. I think top to bottom it was a pretty entertaining show. The Divas match was not that great. I hate to always seem to have something negative to say about a Divas type match, but it was the only one on the card that didn't really seem like it clicked all that well together. One thing I'll mention about them and moving forward is that if you watch Botchamania at all, and I'm a big fan of that particular program, there are always moments on there where they show people who are getting called out for their having mentioned or having called for a spot during the show, when you can hear them. And Paige and some of the other divas are particularly loud when they call for their spots. It's always kind of funny, especially in range of a Japanese audience, because they are very reverent. They tend to sit there just watching almost without reacting that much. Very different from American audiences and the rest of the world. But you can really hear them quite clearly on the broadcast. But regardless, the rest of the show was great. You had a good lead-in match there with Jericho and Neville. Some people were confused about why Jericho would be put over in that scenario, because of the fact that Neville is the next big thing, and he's one of these guys who's going to be pushed to the moon apparently. But Jericho, he had a big following in Japan, and there was no reason for him to not get over in that particular instance, in my opinion. The other big match coming out of that was the fact that we mentioned Kevin Owens here a minute ago. He did lose the NXT title to Finn Balor in what was another great contest. I think Finn Balor now is going to be the guy who gets an opportunity to run with that belt and do a lot with it. You've had, by virtue of a number of injuries, him become the next guy to carry that particular brand, and I think they could not do a better job of pushing him. He's done great work with that demon character and with his in-ring persona since becoming Finn Balor. Of course, he was Prince Devitt at one point in his career, who had a big connection and big fan base and following in Japan. So it made a lot of sense to give him that belt on that occasion, and I think that was a class act and a great way of doing it, and elevating him to the next position that he's going to be in within the company. Moving on to one more WWE related item before we go into our local news. Tough Enough continues. The last particular episode was on Tuesday evening yesterday. I have to say I'm continuing to watch the show, but I'm starting to lose interest in this thing particularly quickly, because it seems like there's one de facto guy on the show who's going to be I don't want to call him a ringer, but he's pretty much close to being that, Patrick. he tweeted during the Beast in the East special that he was the only one who was up watching the show. And there were some comments made by the judges on Tough Enough panel who said, we can go ahead and end this right now, as far as we're concerned, because he seems to be one of the only guys who's really got a passion for what they're doing. A lot of these other guys are here for a payday, for an opportunity to make money and get their face out there or whatever else, because they're all models, they're all bodybuilders. I don't think they really have a passion for wrestling. Patrick seems to. And it's not a surprise because he's one of, I think, 2 people on the show at this point who are left who have actual experience in the wrestling business. He, I think, if I remember correctly, has trained and worked with Maryland Championship Wrestling. So good on him. Continue to work hard and show yourself, and you'll get an opportunity there. But when you've got the judges coming forward and saying, we can go ahead and end this now, that's not a good sign. Especially when you consider the fact they've got, 10 or 12 weeks maybe left of the show to produce, and they're already ready to call it. So it just goes to show you what's happening there. Moving on to our local event segment here, we've got a couple of shows to highlight here this week. Looks like from what we can tell there are 4 events coming up here this weekend. So let's go ahead and show you those posters and get that information out to you right now. We'll be back to wrap up the show and call it a week. So here you go with our local wrap up. Alright folks, there you have it, our wrap up of the events that are happening in this part of the world this coming weekend. We appreciate the fact that we have some events to attend and some things to look forward to, but we'd also like to point out that if you're a promoter, wrestler, or in some way involved in a promotion that's happening or that's having an event and you don't see your material on our show, it's because we didn't know about it. So if you are interested in having your poster put on the site, the Facebook page, or these particular videos, let us know. Drop us a line via the Facebook page, Twitter, YouTube even has a messaging option in here. We'd be glad to have them out there for you because that's what we're all about, letting people know that these shows are happening in this part of the world. That said, we appreciate you guys tuning in. We are still trying to grow this brand, and you can see behind me here, we have some new signage behind me. We're not just doing a white backdrop anymore. We've got an actual banner. Yes, we're moving up in the world. If you're not investing in your product, you're losing face with your product, I guess you could say. But we appreciate you guys tuning in. If you would, go ahead and like and subscribe these videos. That lets us know that we're getting out to you guys and that we're reaching the people that we're hoping to reach. We appreciate you tuning in, and we'll see you again down the road.